Ladies and gentlemen, we are 2 days into Operation Economic Outcast that is waged by the US on Iran. And it's safe to say that it is a nothing burger, to be honest.
Today, at President Trump's direction, the United States Treasury has begun Operation Economic Outcast, an unprecedented campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran and its enablers. In the Second World War, D-Day marked the historic beginning of a campaign with our allies to target and drive the enemy from its positions, including those in third countries. Today, in that same spirit, we are launching an economic onslaught against Iran's financial connections around the globe. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone.
Operation Economic Outcast is essentially the US applying sanctions, not on Iran, because the US has applied maximum sanctions on Iran, but on countries that trade with Iran, such as China, such as Russia, and Pakistan, and many other countries around Iran. Now, this is funny because the US has applied already sanctions on Russia because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And China? Well, this is China's response.
China's cooperation with Iran is conducted within the framework of international law and should not be disrupted. China is closely following the developments and will take all necessary measures to firmly safeguard its rights and interests.
China has effectively said to the US that you have no authority to apply sanctions because this is not within international law. You're essentially operating outside of international law, and we do not recognize your sanctions. We are focused on our interests, and so we'll continue to trade with Iran based on our interests. And essentially, Russia has said the same thing to the US. Now, if Russia's not going to comply with this, if China's not going to comply with this, if Pakistan is not going to comply with this, then the effectiveness of these economic sanctions are not going to achieve the objective that the US wants of putting pressure on Iran such that they give concessions with respect to the Strait of Hormuz. Now, why really is the US applying these sanctions right now? I mean, for one, if they had a proper plan, they would have applied this when they started the war, not waiting 6 months after they initiated the war to be like, hey, let's think of other ideas to put pressure on Iran. Just shows how incompetent and unprepared they are for this war. And also, if the US controls the Strait of Hormuz, as they keep on saying, then why are they putting these sanctions on Iran right now so that they open the Strait of Hormuz? I thought their navy is destroyed, their air force is destroyed. Trump just said they've demined all the strait and there's free passage in the strait. So why are they asking for Iran to open the strait and trying to put pressure by applying these sanctions, which, by the way, the US has applied sanctions on Iran for 47 years. Has that worked for the US? What these sanctions actually do is they give the IRGC more power, because instead of multinational companies coming in to provide services and provide infrastructure, it's the IRGC who has to do it because there's no one else that does it. And so the IRGC has more control and more power through these sanctions. This is the craziness of these strategies that they're not really thinking about. The next thing you need to ask is, when have sanctions actually worked without kinetic action to change the government or the attitudes of the government? You know, the British applied sanctions on the Germans in 1914, which led to hundreds of thousands of deaths because of those, essentially an embargo, which limited food into Germany. But that didn't change the government. It was the war, actual troops landing, that changed the government. The Americans did the same thing with the Japanese during World War II, and that led to Pearl Harbor, which then kind of led to the US dropping nukes on Japan. They did the same thing with Iraq, applying sanctions, killing hundreds of thousands of children because there's limited amount of food that can enter, limited amount of medicine that can enter. But it was the invasion of Iraq that led to the regime change. And they did the same thing to Libya and Syria and numerous other countries. There was always a kinetic action that resulted into regime change or the change in attitude of the government. Never just the sanctions, never just the embargo or economic warfare. I mean, they're doing that to Cuba right now, but it's not leading to regime change. And so what is the purpose of this? This is to prepare for the attacks on Iran. Because, I mean, they can't be that stupid that they think that this will actually result in, concessions given by Iran. But I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and believe that actually this is just a strategy that is preparing for the attacks that will follow after the midterm elections in November in the US to weaken Iran as much as possible before they go full out attacking Iran. Because it has never worked by itself. And I know Trump doesn't like to read, but I'm assuming he has advisors around him that do read and that do understand history. So they're going out full on with economic sanctions to put pressure on Iran as much as possible, with the hope that maybe they give concessions, but that won't happen. But also to put pressure just so that we can get to the midterm elections in November, and then the attacks will happen either the end of this year or the beginning of next year after trying to weaken Iran. The problem they have, of course, is that the big countries are not going to abide by this, but also that, Iran has a huge border. It's twice the size of the Mexican-US border. So you're not going to be able to restrain the import or export of goods completely. Iran borders 13 countries through land borders and water borders. It's madness to think that you can actually apply complete economic sanctions. The problem that the US has, of course, is that they're draining their strategic petroleum reserves, which is now below 219 million barrels in this oil inventory that they have been releasing since the start of the war to ensure that oil prices are low, there isn't a oil supply shock or shortages. But that's just a temporary buffer. And in a couple of weeks, that's going to be depleted. Now, because the US has said everything is fine, we're letting oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz more than before the war now, is what they're saying. We're actually going to have an oil glut, an oil extra supply. People have reduced their demands because of that, demand of oil usage, because they think everything is fine. And so normally what you'd see if oil prices are very high is that demand will decrease a lot. But because the oil price has been suppressed by this temporary buffer of the strategic petroleum reserve, it's going to be a complete shock when the US depletes its strategic petroleum reserve or cannot drain it as fast as it needs to ensure that there isn't a supply shock, which will happen in a few weeks. And that's what Iran knows. And therefore, they're okay to wait for there to be a complete shock, not now, but in September and in October, right before the midterm elections. Because they understand that Trump is not serious about diplomatic solutions. They understand that Trump does want regime change in Iran. The reason why you apply sanctions is so that then you could go kinetically and do the regime change or attempt to do the regime change. And the hilarious thing is that Trump now, while this is all happening, is starting a trade war with Canada. And do you know what Canada exports to the US? Oil. The US oil imports, 60% of them come from Canada, about 4 million barrels a day. That's who you're starting a trade war with right now when you have all this oil supply disruption? It's just insanity. But that's who we're dealing with. That's who Trump is. Now, the hilarious thing is that the US itself doesn't want to apply those sanctions because applying those sanctions on countries is going to result in huge economic negative effects because those countries might retaliate. They might have to sell the US debt or treasuries that they hold as a retaliation, which would increase the interest rates on the US debt and make it more expensive for the US to service its debt. Remember, the US is 40 trillion in debt. And the number one expense in the US government is not the military, which is now going to go to 1.5 trillion as a budget, but the interest on the debt that they have. That's the number one expense in the US. And this was confirmed by Scott Bessent in that same announcement.
Describe this as an economic D-Day, but D-Day wasn't a threat of an invasion, and the US didn't give a timeline to Germany. So why not impose the sanctions today?
Well, we are giving everyone the opportunity to remedy bad behavior. Why would I want to blow up the global financial system? We believe that it is important to level set and give people a cure period, but they should know that will move very quickly and that we are serious.
Why would I want to blow up the global financial system? He said it himself. he understands that this is a double-edged sword. If you use it, you're attacking the US because countries will retaliate. Countries will sell their US treasuries, the US debt, at a time when interest rates on that debt is really high. And therefore, if people sell it, the interest rate will continue to go up, which is an increase of expense in the US at a time when the debt is 40 trillion. And once you use the US financial system and the dollar as a weapon, that will just push people to find an alternative system, which is what the BRICS organization is trying to do, to create a currency that's pegged to a number of currencies plus gold. You know, when you used it on Russia and you're using it on other countries, well, now countries are relying less and less on the dollar. They're trying to use local currency, and that's what Iran is trying to achieve also. And so this is just going to accelerate that process, but also at the same time, because of course countries will feel the pain of such a situation straight away, they will retaliate against the US, especially China, where the US wants rare earth minerals and many other things that pretty much all are produced or processed in China. Remember, the rare earth minerals are used in weapon manufacturing at a time when the US has used up most of its ammunition, especially for the interceptors and the precise attack missiles. And therefore, they really need a lot of this. So what does this all mean? Well, one, it means that the US is just making threats. It's barking a lot because they're not applying the sanctions straight away right now. They're saying, hey, we're threatening you with sanctions if you don't comply with the isolating Iran. Countries are not taking the US seriously anymore. They're saying basically, we don't see that you have that authority to apply those sanctions. It's not within international law. The image of the US is being destroyed. And so the effectiveness of the economic tools that the US has is being diminished. Not to say it's not powerful at the moment. It is powerful, but it's being diminished and leading more and more people to find an alternative system to operate away from US sanctions that the US is dishing out left, right, and center. This also means that the US is preparing for escalation because it should understand that economic sanctions doesn't lead to anything. We have all of history to prove that it does not. So this means that they are preparing for, continued attacks on Iran, but waiting for the midterm elections to happen so that this is over and then they could escalate where oil prices will really skyrocket. But the reality is that oil prices will skyrocket before the midterm elections because the buffers that the US is using to suppress oil prices is going to be depleted before then. And Iran knows that, and therefore Iran is very comfortable to wait it out. And that's not to say that Iran isn't going through some economic pressure and, people are going to go through pain because of those sanctions that have already been applied for 47 years. But Iran knows how to deal with high inflation and economic pressure. The US, on the other hand, they live a very comfortable life for the most part. And therefore, an increase in, oil prices, which turn into inflation, increase in, food prices, that's going to hit home really strong. And that's going to impact the US elections in November. So I expect oil prices to go up. I expect escalation to happen after the midterm elections. And I don't think this is going to lead to any change in Iran. If anything, they will be more aggressive if the economic sanctions are going to hit. Because why would they wait for their economy to be destroyed? Why wouldn't they just break the embargo, the naval embargo that the US has imposed on Iran? No one would wait for that. They would just kind of break it. But we'd love to know your thoughts about whether the US or Iran can withstand more economic pressure. If you did like this video, do hit the like, please, and subscribe. And we'll see you very, very soon.